This is James A. Young, a 45-year-old teacher from East Canton, Ohio, who on the surface appeared as an average man. There was nothing sinister about him, nothing that raised a red flag. If you saw him stroll by on the midway, you wouldn't even give him a second glance. And by the words of his friends and family, he was just an honest man, a respectable fellow, and most importantly, someone who would never take a major risk. Or so they thought. I hate to say it, but in the summer of 2015, that last statement would go up in smoke, for he became the victim of an accident, a roller coaster accident at Cedar Point. And normally in these situations, I would give all my sympathy to the victim, I would feel bad for them, but Mr. Young is a rare exception. I just can't feel sorry for this guy, because he is the cause of his own death, and thankfully wasn't the cause of anyone else's death, because his decision was reckless, stupid, seriously dangerous. I'm just thankful there was no other casualty, because Mr. Young, he made the choice to jump over a fence to retrieve his cell phone. What kind of person has this mindset? Personally, I never use my phone, I barely have it on, and I do understand most people, they grip to their phones and never want to let it go, but I just assume people have a baseline understanding to never risk your life over an object. I mean, sure, boo-hoo, you may have to buy a new phone, but your life is worth a lot more. Sadly though, this young man couldn't see that, which meant August 13th would be his final day left to live. But to really drill this point home, let me just tell you every detail of what happened that day. Right off the bat, the ride that came down and killed Mr. Young in one fatal blow like a car bustling down the freeway was Raptor, the invert from 1994. Now, for anyone who's ridden Raptor or any invert in general, you know these rides are incredibly snappy. Going into each inversion, you're just rapidly pulled through, especially since each transition is very tight. What I'm just trying to get at is that there is a possibility you can lose your stuff, and that doesn't just go for inverts. Any ride there is a chance you can lose your possessions, but in the special case of Raptor, the odds, they're still not in your favor. It's no different. So if possible, don't bring your stuff on the ride. Wallet, phone, keys, leave it to the side. And if you still need some extra incentive on doing this, how about you look at the giant box of broken phones at the entrance of almost any attraction, with a sign that says, hey, this is what happened to other people who brought their phone on the ride. So how about you learn from their mistake and don't do the same? I know it's annoying to put your stuff in a locker, but there are other solutions. You can wear cargo shorts, bring a drawstring bag. It's not that hard. But most people, they don't want to do this. It's too much of a hassle. They'd rather be a gambler and take the risk. And I hate to say it, but Mr. Young, he was a gambler. He took his phone on the ride, and guess what? It flew out of his pocket, only to land in the restricted area. Now, that may sound bad, but this was actually the best case scenario for Mr. Young, since the restricted area is one of the only places where crew members can access, meaning they can easily just go in and retrieve the phone. However, if Mr. Young's phone landed somewhere else, then getting it back would be a lot more difficult. Remember, Raptor is a very compact ride. It's situated between buildings, restaurants, a midway cutting through the center of the attraction, so guests can have access to Blue Streak. This meant that during development, Cedar Point knew they had to keep the track relatively high above the ground to prevent adjusting or redoing any pre-existing facilities. There's really only a few areas where the train comes close to the ground. That would be before going into the Cobra Roll and before the final corkscrew. The rest of the ride, it's trying to stay high up. Which means that Mr. Young, he could have lost his phone on top of a restaurant. He could have lost it on top of the midway canopy. But he ended up getting kind of lucky, having the phone land somewhere maintenance can access. So what do you think Mr. Young did in this situation? Do you think after he realized, oh shoot, I don't have my phone, he went to an employee and asked them, hey, my phone fell off during the ride. Can you please help me get it back? Do you think he took that rational approach and just asked someone? Well, no, he didn't. He thought the best course of action would be to jump the fence. Yep, jump the fence into a restricted area where the train is constantly passing every 2 minutes. Just why? Why did he think this was going to be a good idea? Was the warning sign not a big enough hint? Did he assume the employees wouldn't care about his problems? Did he even bother asking? Because they would have cared. They would be more than happy to help. They would tell him, oh, we're sorry, just come back at the end of the working day, then we'll have someone go inside and retrieve the phone when the ride is closed. There's nothing more to it, there's no catch. It's super easy, barely an inconvenience, but no, I guess he didn't want to be a bother, so it was just better to jump over, land on the gravel, and get his phone. If you're not putting it together yet, Yes, the train hit him and killed him in one lethal collision. It was right before the train went into its final corkscrew and struck the back of his head. No surprise because, again, this is the area where the train goes low to the ground. Honestly, I'm shocked he got hit in the head because I'd assume the train wouldn't even clear his torso, but I digress. It's truly a miracle how no one on that train got hurt. For some reason, the front row was empty, which thankfully meant that Mr. Young, he couldn't break someone's leg, but it still didn't stop his head from coming in contact with the pink metal frame under the seats. And that had to be brutal. Imagine they took a baseball bat and full force hit the back of your skull. Two things could have happened. One, you would have been knocked out and be injured, or two, you could have gotten a severe crack and could have internally bled to death. And that would be with just a baseball bat. This is a 1 to 2 ton train with a top speed of 57 miles an hour. Now, obviously, it wasn't going that fast when it hit Mr. Young. The ride was almost nearing its final brake run, so it was probably going 25 or 30. But despite how fast Raptor was going, it wouldn't really matter. It's like a scenario if you got hit by a car going at 5 miles an hour, it's still gonna knock you down and it's gonna cause injury. Plus, it didn't really help that all the force from the 2-ton train was confined to his head. I hate to be that guy, but there was no chance of him surviving. I just hope that his death was quick, because despite this being all his fault, I didn't want him to suffer because no one should ever experience any long, extensive pain. But following the accident, how did Cedar Point respond? Because at first glance, it did seem like someone fell off the ride. And that's certainly what the public and the media thought. Especially since Cedar Point, they were kind of under hot water already. 2 years earlier in 2013, there was another accident on their defunct Shoot the Rapids ride, a story maybe for another time, and then this. It's clear why the public would be more spiteful. This was death, not injury. So, Cedar Point, they kept silent, waited for the investigation to conclude, and they were in the clear. They did nothing wrong, Mr. Young did this to himself, so Cedar Point had nothing to worry about. But the family of Mr. Young, they were pissed off at Cedar Point, because 6 months later, the park was asked if they were gonna raise the fence to Raptor, and they responded with a nice, firm no. And the family, they were annoyed. I mean, I get where they were coming from, but Cedar Point, they were in the right. They did not need to raise the fence since this isn't a continuous problem at Cedar Point. Everyone already knows not to jump over into a restricted area when there is a clear sign that says, keep out. Cedar Point, they do not have to do more. They gave the appropriate warning. The fence is high enough because even if they made it taller, who says people can't scale that? There's no point. I know the family's upset, but this is all Mr. Young's fault. There's no one else to blame, and because of his mistakes, his family has to suffer from it. Of course, this accident happened over 7 years ago, and it is now long forgotten. No one really remembers Mr. Young, but that doesn't mean we can't learn something from him. Like a drunk deciding to go behind the wheel, he is responsible for turning on the ignition. He knew the risk, he knew what may have happened, but he still went through with it. I'm just glad he didn't bring anyone down with him.